Hello friends! I just ordered a fun day from room service, and while I'm waiting for it, I thought I'd discuss another Nancy Drew book versus game with you. This is a series I've been making for a while now, in which I discuss the Nancy Drew games and the books they're based on. So you might be thinking, something's wrong here. This isn't Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake, the next game in this series after Secret of the Scarlet Hand, the last Nancy Drew game you made one of these videos on. Well, I've decided to skip the Ghost Dogs book versus game video for now, because it's based on two books which presents a more complex challenge. So instead, today we'll be discussing The Haunted Carousel. The book was originally published in 1983, and is number 72 in the Nancy Drew Mystery Stories series, while the game was released in 2003 and is the 8th Nancy Drew video game. This is one of the few Nancy Drew books for which we know the ghostwriter, James Duncan Lawrence, who before The Haunted Carousel previously ghostwrote for the Tom Swift Jr. series. He would go on to ghostwrite the Nancy Drew books The Bluebeard Room and The Phantom of Venice, which were the basis for the Nancy Drew games The Curse of Blackmore Manor and, you guessed it, The Phantom of Venice. Fun fact, he also co-wrote the text adventure game Moon Mist, which is known as the earliest video game to feature a gay character. Fuck, I forgot my book. A newspaper reporter challenges Nancy to solve a weird mystery involving an amusement park merry-go-round. Why does the carousel light up in the middle of the night, revolving and playing music when no one's around? In search of an answer, Nancy finds herself matching wits with two clever criminals, and tries to hunt down one of them in the park's haunted house. Meanwhile, a teenage heiress seeks the young detective's help, deciphering a strange flower riddle that her father presented to her just before he died. The plot thickens when a woman who may hold a vital clue to the mystery suddenly disappears. With the help of her friend, Ned, Nancy sets out to catch the sinister culprits, but discovers too late that she and Ned are the ones really caught in the trap. My favorite thing about the synopsis is the way it just completely friend-zones Ned. Forget everything you think you know about the Haunted Carousel. This book has very little in common with the game. In fact, I can count the similarities on one hand. A carousel that is haunted, Joy Trent, and a past heist. This is going to become more of a trend as we move through this series, as her interactives start to take more creative license with the source material, meaning that the games bear only a passing resemblance to the books they're inspired by. With that in mind, let's start the ride.
Dear Ned, well, here I am at Captain's Cove Amusement Park, about to try to figure out what's behind all the weird things that have been happening here lately.
Chapter 1 opens on Nancy, Bess, and George babysitting 3 young children at Riverside Park, not Captain's Cove, in River Heights, not New Jersey. The kids have only one desire: to see the park's haunted carousel. Several times recently, in the middle of the night when the park was closed, the carousel had suddenly lit up and begun playing music and turning around. Each time when people came running to investigate, the carousel would stop and go dark again. The spooky incidents had attracted wide interest, and many wild guesses were being made about the cause. Abruptly, a local newspaper reporter approaches Nancy and challenges her to solve the mystery of the haunted carousel. Apparently they couldn't think of any better reason for Nancy to investigate the mystery, like for example, having a friend of Nancy's dad's hire her to investigate peculiar occurrences at the park. The girls then bump into the Trompels, a couple visiting the United States from Switzerland who have only 2 planned destinations in mind: New York City and River Heights. You know, the 2 top tourist destinations in America. I'm sure the Trompels are excited to see some iconic American locations in person, such as the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, Bedford Carpet Factory, and Mahoney Anvil Co. Mr. Trompel's wallet has been stolen, and Nancy volunteers to help recover it, seeing as she knows a good deal about the ways of criminals. She explains that pickpockets always come in 3s. There's the person who distracts the target by bumping into them, the dip, who actually picks their pocket, and a third crook who extracts everything of value and then dumps whatever's left. Similar to my process for making these videos. Anyway, just ignore this because the book later pretends that there are, and always have been, only 2 criminals. Nancy isolates one of the thieves and makes the bold decision to confront him on her own. This plan quickly goes wrong when the other 2 culprits join their friend and threaten Nancy to beat it, lady. Nancy deduces that these 3 small-time pickpockets are deadly serious and ready to use force. So they're about to kill her in broad daylight in this crowded small-town amusement park. Luckily, before they can, the police show up and scare the thieves away and return the money to the Trompels. Thank God, I was worried they'd have to miss their trip to Jeffrey's Autorama. Nancy and the girls finally take the children to the carousel, but only the kids ride it. At least Nancy gets to experience the innocent joy of riding a wooden horse at 7 miles per hour in the game. The carousel was certainly a beauty, with flashing mirrors and gilt cupids and other ornate decorations. Its name, Wonderland Gallop, was painted on the metal canopy in fancy gold and red letters. The horses looked spirited and realistic and were beautifully painted. While the kids ride, Nancy introduces herself to Leo Novak, the owner and operator of the carousel. Nancy discovers that, unlike in the game, the carousel has had multiple homes. While it originally operated in Riverside Park, 8 years previous it was moved to another park in the Midwest, before more recently being moved back to its original home of Riverside Park. A fun element of this book is that Bess and George are staying on a houseboat. When the girls return to the houseboat after a long day out at the park, they notice that there's someone on the boat. Nancy grabs a hefty rock, and George picks up a tree branch, ready to blast the barnacles out of this intruder. With her lips close to George's ear, Nancy whispered that she would tiptoe around the bow of the boat, while George went around the stern. That way, she added, we'll close in on him from 2 directions at once, and he won't be able to deal with both of... Nancy broke off with a start as a masculine voice suddenly shouted, "Boo!" George screamed and clutched her friend. Nancy whirled around. Both girls shrieked, "Ned!" at the sight of a tall, husky young man in a western shirt and jeans, who had just leaped out at them from around a corner of the cabin. He was Nancy's boyfriend, Ned Nickerson. Seeing how startled the girls were, he put an arm around each of them reassuringly and apologized. "Sorry, I didn't really mean to scare the wits out of you." When he noticed the rock and tree branch they were clutching, Ned chuckled. "Guess I'm the one who should have been scared. Might have been lights out if I'd gotten beamed with one of those." Fucking Ned. This scene is exemplary of an aspect I really dislike about this book. The version of Nancy in the book of the Haunted Carousel is a girl who is brave, but only in her head, which leads her into dangerous situations from which she needs to be rescued. For instance, when approached by the 3 thieves in Chapter 1, Nancy despairs to herself, "If only help would come," and bites her lip to keep it from trembling before she is saved by the police moments later. This isn't the Nancy I know and love, who is fully capable of standing up for herself and extricating herself from dangerous situations using her own ingenuity. Ned invites Nancy out for a date, and she asks him if he'd like to romantically stake out the carousel with her. Ned agrees, but with a caveat. "I want you to promise me something." "What's that?" Nancy's blue eyes twinkled. "That you'll never go there late at night, unless I'm in River Heights, so I can go with you," Ned said earnestly. "Okay?" "Well, perhaps you're right," Nancy said. Ned didn't realize that she had actually promised nothing. Nancy, true manipulation queen. Before going to the amusement park, Nancy stops by her house to grab a sweater and tell Carson Drew what she's up to. The distinguished attorney had long since learned to trust his daughter's good judgment and quick-witted ability to deal with emergencies. "Very well," he nodded. "If Ned's with you, I won't worry." Does he really trust Nancy if he thinks she needs Ned to protect her? Fucking men. Nancy and Ned wait by the carousel for a while, and then Nancy spots something. I need to stop doing this all the time. The little wagging finger movement. she could make out two dark figures heading toward the carousel. They stepped up on the outer edge of the merry-go-round, and Nancy saw them dimly silhouetted by a small glow of light, as if a flashlight had been turned on. After pausing for a moment, they began moving from horse to horse. "What the dickens are they up to?" Ned grumbled. "It's hard to see with their backs turned." He handed the binoculars to Nancy. As she focused on the two intruders, they stopped and now appeared to be centering their interest on one particular horse. An instant later, Nancy caught her breath as the lights of the carousel suddenly blazed on. Organ music churned loudly, and the merry-go-round began to revolve. "What happened?" Ned exclaimed. "Did those two spooks start it up?" No, they weren't even near the controls. In fact, they almost fell off when the merry-go-round started turning. I think they were caught by surprise. And scared. Ned chases after the mysterious figures, and Nancy lags behind him until she literally trips over his motionless body on the ground. Unfortunately, Ned's fine. The next day, the local paper publishes an article announcing Nancy's intention to investigate the Haunted Carousel, resulting in a slew of phone calls. Hannah Gruen, the Drew's housekeeper, fields the calls and determines that only one feels genuine. A call from a woman named Joy Trent, who wants Nancy to solve a private mystery for her. Nancy and Bess return to Riverside Park, where they're confronted by a policeman. Apparently, the small gang Nancy encountered in the park the day before is actually composed of two known criminals who are wanted by the St. Louis police, implausibly named Fingers Malone and Baldy Krebs. It's like an AI picked their names after absorbing 90 hours of 1940s film noir B-movies. Or 1940s film noir B-movie porn spoofs. As she and Bess head toward the exit of the park, Nancy gasps. "Look! There's Fingers Malone!" Fingers notices Nancy staring and starts running. Nancy chases Fingers to the haunted house, where he pulls out a roll of tickets. Apparently these tickets are an optional purchase. Visitors to Riverside can either buy a roll of tickets at the park entrance or pay admission individually at each ride. So I can only assume that poor Fingers bought these intending to go on all the rides, and Nancy interrupted his lovely day out at the amusement park. Nancy makes her way through the haunted house until she gets to a closed door. Someone began thumping on the door from the other side, shouting, "Let me out! Let me out!" Nancy's heart beat faster. Was this another haunted house trick? Or was it possible that Malone had robbed someone after entering and had locked up his victim? Taking a deep breath, Nancy reached out to unlock the door, then jumped back with a start as a grinning skeleton popped out at her with a blood-curdling scream. As her foot touched the moth-eaten carpet behind her, the floor seemed to give way under her weight. The next thing Nancy knew, she was plunging down a chute into utter darkness. She landed on what felt like a swarming mass of small furry objects. With a little cry of fright, Nancy scrambled away from them. I've lost track of the amount of OSHA violations. This place is insane. Then Nancy spots Fingers. Picking up the first makeshift weapon she could lay a hand on, which happened to be a broken chair leg, Nancy ventured cautiously in pursuit. I love how Nancy is constantly ready to beat a man to death in this book. However, while pursuing Fingers, Nancy is hit on the head and passes out. Upon awakening, she finds that neither the police nor Bess saw Fingers leave the haunted house. When Nancy returns home, Hannah tells her that she missed a visitor, Joy Trent. What did this Joy Trent look like, Hannah? Oh, I'd say she was a bit younger than you, Nancy, and she had very coppery red hair and freckles. Also, I imagine her parents must be very well-to-do, because her clothes were lovely and she was driving a very expensive-looking foreign sports car. But when I was talking to her, I noticed her eyes were two different colors. One was green and one was brown. So in the book, Joy looks like a Mary Sue from a self-insert One Direction Wattpad fanfic. Nancy meets George's friend Neil, an engineer who claims that he knows how the carousel is being moved as if by a ghost. Neil says, "Do you know what a radio relay is?" "Not really." Nancy dimpled and shook her head. Nancy is dimpling in this book. What have they done to my girl? Neil then proceeds to mansplain the concept of a remote control to Nancy. Nancy also learns that the carousel is somehow connected to a cowboy artist named Walter Cruz, who worked for the carousel's original owner and was romantically involved with his daughter. We'll put a pin in that for now. Then Nancy finally meets Joy Trent. Joy arranges to meet Nancy for lunch the following day. Not sure why they can't just talk now, unless Mr. James Duncan Lawrence was really struggling to meet the word count. Nancy arrives at Joy's house to see a woman driving away. I swear this is important. Inside, she meets Joy's guardian, Aunt Selma, a thin, middle-aged woman with a disagreeable expression. Joy says she wants Nancy to help me figure out Daddy's last message. Aunt Selma isn't keen. Joy says, "Don't mind Aunt Selma. She's nicer than she seems. The only trouble is, she treats me like a little backward child who can hardly be trusted to cross the street by herself. She sure sounds like a perfectly lovely woman." Joy revealed that she was an only child and an orphan. Her father, who sounded like a hard-driving business executive with little time to spare, had died several months ago. He doesn't really sound like the playful, whimsical guy in the game. Definitely not the type of man who would invent Miles, the magnificent memory machine. Like in the game, Joy's mother died when she was a toddler. Joy reveals, "I love to ride the carousel. Daddy took me there whenever he could. In fact, he even bought me my favorite steed on the merry-go-round. There was one particular horse on it that I always used to ride. It was the lead horse, the most beautiful creature you ever saw. When I found out the merry-go-round was about to be taken away, I was broken-hearted. So Daddy made a deal to buy the horse from the carousel owner and wrote him out a check then and there." Pretty similar to the game, except in this case, Joy doesn't have trauma-induced amnesia and doesn't need Nancy as her amateur therapist to help her retrieve her repressed memories. In the game, the carousel horse was stolen, but in the book, Joy lent it to the River Heights Daycare Center. "Sounds wonderful," Nancy said. "Dimpling? I'd love to see it." I actually cannot believe this book has Nancy dimpling not just once, but multiple times. Who is this girl? Nancy asks Joy to tell her about her private mystery. Maybe riddle would be a better word for it, Joy began. Joy's father left her a mysterious envelope when he died, just in his desk drawer, not in an easy bake oven that he transformed into a sentient therapy robot. The envelope contains a slip of paper which reads, "Iris equals question mark equals old glory." Iris was Joy's mother's name, and like in the game, they don't have any photos of her, so instead, in every room, there's at least one bowl or vase filled with irises. There were also ceramic and glass likenesses of the flower, wall paintings of irises, iris-decorated drapes, and numerous other such objects or furnishings. Joy's father in the book and the game, really an example of how you heal from grief in the most unhinged way possible. The next day, the mysterious woman Nancy saw leaving Joy's house calls Nancy and asks her to deliver a package to Joy. She refuses to tell Nancy her name, what the package contains, or why she wants Nancy to deliver it, but Nancy decides to trust her own judgment of the woman's character and agrees. Nancy's character judgments boil down to smiles a lot, good and trustworthy, doesn't smile, mean and bad. Joy opens the package and finds that it contains a single iris and a card which reads, "If you care to get in touch with me, call the Regent Hotel and ask for Mrs. Rose Harrod in room 922. Joy gets excited, but Aunt Selma says, "The woman who sent this is obviously nothing but a fraud and a troublemaker. Joy, I absolutely forbid you to contact that creature." Joy and Aunt Selma argue, and Joy points out that Aunt Selma has only been appointed as her legal guardian temporarily. Joy went on, "It's absurd to forbid me to see someone who may be able to tell me about my mother or help to explain Daddy's riddle." Turning to her friend for support, Joy added, "Don't you agree, Nancy?" To which Nancy responds, "Why not wait and ask me that question tomorrow, Joyce?" she suggested with a calm smile, which would piss me off to no end if I was Joy. However, Nancy doubts that she did the right thing. At the dinner table that evening, she told her father what had happened and asked his opinion on the subject. "What should I have done, Daddy?" "What did you feel like doing?" said Carson Drew. "To be perfectly honest, I thought her aunt was behaving like a stuffy old bitch. Oh, sorry, witch. I felt like telling her to f*** off." No, I felt like telling Joy to use her own common sense and do just as she pleased. Not what I would have said, but... That night, Nancy has a sleepover with Bess and George on the houseboat. And finally, we get some hecking action in this book when Nancy wakes up in the middle of the night and realizes the houseboat has become unmoored, drifting down the river straight into the path of an incoming motorboat. Nancy turns on all the lights on the houseboat and waves a flashlight around, and the motorboat steers out of the way just in time. She then realizes that the mooring line has been deliberately cut. Could a ghost horse do that? I don't think so. The next day, Nancy calls the police detective from St. Louis. He tells her that Fingers was involved in serious gangland crime before he was arrested while working as a carny at an amusement park in St. Louis. I refuse to believe that anyone who calls himself Fingers would be taken seriously in the world of serious gangland crime. The detective says, "Those expert fingers of his turned out to be his downfall." No comment. At Joy Trent's house, Nancy thinks she's partly solved Joy's father's riddle. The young detective was staring at a wall painting of a Civil War battle scene. Nancy pointed at two of the figures in the painting. One, the Union color sergeant, had evidently just been hit by an enemy bullet. As he fell, a companion was snatching the flag from the dying sergeant's hand. "That's an American flag. Old Glory. Notice where the flagstaff is pointing." As she spoke, Nancy's finger traced an invisible line from the spear point at the tip of the flagstaff across the painted canvas and out beyond the edge of the picture frame. The line pointed straight toward a single iris in a slender glass vase standing on a shelf close by. Weirdly convoluted for a children's book, but fine. Also, by the sounds of it, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find an item in Joy's house that isn't pointing towards an iris, considering they're covering all the walls, the floors, and everywhere else in the house, but go off, I guess, Nancy. Nancy asks, "Those words, Iris and Old Glory, what do they suggest to you, Joy? Anything at all? That carousel horse I told you about. When Daddy first bought him for me as a birthday present, I named him Glory because he was so beautiful, and sometimes in those days, when I'd talk about him, I'd refer to him as Old Glory." So there's another similarity with the game. Both carousel horses are named Glory, which feels a bit implausible to me because when I was 6, if I was given a horse for my birthday, I would have named it Horsey. Giddy up, the riddle solution is about to get even more convoluted. "Are you aware," the girl sleuth inquired, "that the flower called Iris also has another name?" Joy nodded. "Some people call them flags." "Right, and by the way, have you ever had algebra in school, Joy?" "Yes, though I must admit I'm no genius at math." "Why?" "Well, if you substitute the word flag for the question mark because Old Glory is also a flag," Nancy explains. "In other words, the message would then read, Iris equals flag equals Old Glory." "Of course, I get it now," Joy exclaimed. "Oh, Nancy, how brilliant of you! So a flag must be the answer to Daddy's riddle." I think it's a little odd that Joy's father's riddle relies on her having a knowledge of algebra when she admits that she's no genius at math. Like, how well did he really know his daughter, you know? Nancy says, "I suspect the place to look for whatever flag he's referring to is right there in his study." Nancy's attention fastened on a metal statuette. It portrayed an old-time Western cavalryman. He was mounted on horseback and carrying a banner in one hand. The statuette, Nancy noticed, was a bronze casting, but evidently the banner had been separately crafted. Its slender staff, which, though rigid, was not much thicker than a stout wire, passed through an opening in the rider's hand. It's fine. Its lower end fitted into the socket on his saddle. Nancy tugged on the flagstaff, pulling it upward through the hole in the rider's hand. This is just weirdly... Okay, I'm not gonna say it. As the staff came loose from its saddle socket, something else came out with it. What is this something else? Well, I'll tell you. A little piece of tissue paper. And what is on this tissue paper? The following is written in italics to emphasize the drama of the situation. It bore a crude drawing of a horse with a frog riding on its back. Probably the best thing that could have been on that piece of paper. No notes. Nancy and Joy are stumped by the horse-riding frog. In the meantime, Nancy goes to the library to research Walter Cruz. Remember the Western artist I mentioned earlier? Nancy reads a book about him and mutters to herself, "So, my hunch was right." But she doesn't let the reader in on what she's discovered. Thanks for nothing, Nancy. Nancy then phones the reporter who gave her the bet to solve the mystery of the Haunted Carousel. She convinces him to run a story about one of the carousel horses being at the daycare center in both the paper and on TV as a lure for the thieves. Then Nancy goes to visit Rose Herod, the woman who gave Joy the iris. However, she discovers that Mrs. Herod has been missing for 24 hours. Nancy traces Mrs. Herod's movements to an airport cafe where she was witnessed getting coffee with a man dressed like the Monopoly Man, with a mustache and cane. Mrs. Herod apparently fell ill and was escorted out by the Monopoly Man. Nancy deduces that she was probably drugged. Luckily, the parking attendant noticed them and wrote down a description of both the appearance and the license plate number of Mr. Monopoly's car. Isn't that fortunate? The car is tracked down in a small town called Fishwick. Thankfully, the first person Nancy talks to in Fishwick is a gas station attendant who noticed Mrs. Herod and the Monopoly Man and is able to point out where they went. A cottage right across the street from the gas station. How fortuitous! Inside the cottage, Nancy finds Mrs. Herod, bound and gagged. This is such lazy writing. So much of Nancy's discovery of Mrs. Herod's location is down to luck and other people's keen observational skills. If the parking attendant hadn't noticed Mrs. Herod and the Monopoly Man leaving the airport, she probably never would have been found, her disappearance forever a mystery. Thank God for Nancy's years of detective experience. Without it, she probably never would have been able to ask, "Have you seen this woman?" That night, Nancy and Ned stake out the carousel. Again, carousel starts moving, and Nancy catches Leo Novak in the act. He was the one using the remote control to start up the carousel. But the night isn't over. She and Ned rush to the daycare center and sneak in to find the Monopoly Man and a man dressed like an overage hippie attempting to steal glory. As they're spying, clumsy oaf Ned knocks over a chair and reveals his and Nancy's presence. Nancy attacks one of the men with a chair, but Ned is basically useless, and Nancy begins to worry about their chances. Fortunately, they're saved by a mysterious interloper. An insurance investigator! Everyone say yay for insurance! Yay! Meanwhile, the disguises are falling off the overage hippie and the Monopoly Man, revealing them as Baldy Krebs and Fingers Malone, respectively. Nancy realizes that Fingers probably put on his disguise while in the haunted house, and that's why no one saw him come out. The next day, Nancy gathers all the major players at the daycare center and does a dramatic breakdown of the crime. Buckle in! We've had a number of mysterious happenings in River Heights recently, but one way or another they all have to do with this carousel horse of Joy's, which, incidentally, happens to be extremely valuable. He was carved by a famous Western artist named Walter Cruz, and the director of the River Heights Art Museum estimates it may be worth a great deal. Thousands of dollars, in fact. The teenage detective explained that horses had been one of Cruz's favorite subjects, as both a painter and a sculptor, and that she had easily identified his style after consulting the library book that contained pictures of his work. When Cruz carved this horse, Nancy went on, he was an unknown artist. At the time, he was working as a carny roustabout at the same amusement park in St. Louis where the Wonderland Gallop was located. The lead horse on the carousel was damaged by a truck, so as a favor to his girlfriend's father, who then owned the merry-go-round, Walter Cruz carved a replacement horse. Nancy related that Leo Novak was only an employee of the owner when the horse was carved. Then last winter, Nancy went on, Novak read a newspaper story about the late artist Walter Cruz and how his work was now bringing record prices in New York art galleries. He suddenly realized that this was the same Walter Cruz who had carved the replacement horse for the carousel, and if he could get it back, it might be worth a small fortune. Unfortunately for Novak, however, he had been unable to recall the name of the little girl or her father, so he devised a clever plan and moved the carousel back to River Heights. By playing the carousel spookily at night, said Nancy, Novak gained a lot of free publicity for the Wonderland Gallop, which, of course, also helped make it a popular attraction at the amusement park. But his real purpose was to make sure Joy heard that the carousel had returned to River Heights. He was hoping that the news might draw her out to the park for a nostalgic visit. If so, he was sure he would recognize her by her flaming red hair and different colored eyes. Fingers Malone and Baldy Krebs, however, had spoiled Novak's plan. They too were after the horse which Cruz had carved, for a different reason. They were the two dark figures seen by Ned and Nancy the night they kept watch in the park. After failing to find what they were looking for that night, they realized that a new lead horse had been mounted on the merry-go-round. So they came to Leo's trailer later on that same night and scared the truth out of him. He knew the two wanted criminals were highly dangerous, so he told them the whole story of how the horse had been bought by Joy's father. 20 years ago, Fingers was hiding out in that same St. Louis amusement park where the Wonderland Gallop was situated, working as a carny, but he couldn't resist picking pockets. The St. Louis officer then told the history of Fingers Malone, beginning with a prominent local jeweler who had been robbed at the park. The loot was a small parcel of diamonds, which he had just received from New York that afternoon. Fingers Malone was nabbed soon afterwards, but the diamonds were never recovered. Fingers knew he might soon be arrested, so he entrusted the diamonds to his friend, Walt Cruz. As an impish joke, Cruz decided to hide the diamonds inside the carousel horse, which he had just about finished carving for his girlfriend's father. By then, Fingers had been arrested and placed on trial. Cruz, however, managed to get word to him through a confidential letter smuggled to him in the courtroom by a friend. As a result, Fingers went looking for the loot when he broke out of prison 20 years later. They didn't know that John Trent had already found the diamonds when he remounted the horse on a stand of his own design. You got all that? I visualize the plot of this book as one of those bead mazes you always see in doctors' and dentists' waiting rooms. At least 5 different tracks, all twisting and turning around each other, each with a different set of characters or beads connected to them. In the game, the narrative is a lot more straightforward. The carousel was designed by Rolf Kessler, an Austrian creator of bespoke carousels, and the supposed hauntings were caused by Elliot to drive away customers and reduce his workload while he created forgeries of the lead horse he stole from the carousel. And the historical heist was more of a red herring, providing a potential motive even though in reality, Elliot knew nothing about the jewelry stashed in the horse. If you're still awake, I'm sure you'll be glad to hear that this book still isn't over. Nancy still has to solve Joy's father's riddle, aka the drawing of the frog on the horse. As you'll probably know if you've taken Tex's quiz in Secret of Shadow Ranch, a frog is part of a horse's hoof. Nancy notices that one of Glory's hooves is lifted off the ground and discovers that it's hollow. Inside are the diamonds Fingers stole and a letter to Joy from her father. This is probably the detail from the book that's closest to the game. I think it would be really funny if the toddlers at the River Heights Daycare Center had already discovered the secret compartment in the hoof and found the diamonds and thought they were a great new toy and swallowed them and stuck them up their nose and such. Joy's father's letter reveals that Mrs. Harrod is Joy's mother's identical twin sister, and she becomes Joy's guardian instead of Aunt Selma. Fingers and Baldy kidnapped Mrs. Harrod because they were paranoid and they had nothing better to do, I guess. Okay, that's finally the end.
Dear Ned, after trapping Elliot, I managed to pry the exit open and had Harlan call the police. Elliot admitted to stealing the carousel horse and planning the remote control device. He knew that publicity from the hauntings would increase the value of his forgeries.
I'm just gonna come right out and say it. This book is boring. It sucks. and I just included the most pertinent information in this video. You don't know how many descriptions of Nancy eating shrimp cocktail I cut out, man. There's very little action, the plot is slow, meandering, unfocused, and needlessly convoluted, and the titular Haunted Carousel barely features at all. I was gonna complain about the cover for this edition because I think it's stupid that it doesn't have the Haunted Carousel on it, but then I realized it's actually the perfect cover, because the Haunted Carousel doesn't really feature that much in the book anyway. This book has a lot of issues, and not to throw James Duncan Lawrence under the bus, but I'm going to speculate that a lot of those issues might come from having a 64-year-old man write a story about an 18-year-old girl. At the very least, he's responsible for all the dimpling Nancy does in this book. I can definitely envision the creative team at Her Interactive thinking, wow, a haunted carousel, what a fun and cool concept for a story, and then reading the actual book and going, ugh. Much like the ambiguous third crook in the pickpocket scheme, they extracted everything of value from this book and threw the rest of it away like the trash it is.